Hi everyone and welcome to my studio. My name is Emma Colbert, and if you don't already know my work, I suppose I'm best known for painting animals. But I do enjoy a bit of everything from landscapes to still life and people portraits too. But yes, my passion really lies with painting animals, whether it's domestic or wildlife. And recently I've been enjoying combining my love of painting animals with some small landscape studies from my local area. I've been really enjoying breaking away from my normal, very detailed, realistic style, which is quite laborious to create, and playing about with these faster studies where I hope to be able to capture more of these little scenes with one of my own dogs. And it's one of these that I'd like to share with you today. My reference image is a typical scene from one of my walks with Lola. I'm always attracted to bright sunlight and contrasting shadows, and hopefully I'll be able to use those contrasting colours to capture this little scene without too much detail. So whether you're working along with me or you're just watching, I really hope you enjoy the demo.
So the first thing that I did was to sketch out my composition on a plain piece of white paper. Then I've rubbed dark pastel all over the back, and I used this to transfer onto my pastel paper. Now normally with smaller landscapes I will just go for it with the pastels, but in this case I wanted to get the placement of the dog just right. So I often do sketch on a separate piece of paper, and that gives me a nice clean line to work with. Not so important for the rest of the landscape, but certainly important for the little dog. And the first thing that I do is to block in some colours. So my first aim is to get the paper covered with a base layer of colour, and then I can give that all a good blend into the paper and use that as a kind of underpainting for the rest of the process. Now, this is a stage that I don't normally have in my regular style of working when I'm painting something more realistically with more detail in it. I'll tend to work mostly from the background to the foreground, and often from top to bottom on a painting when I'm leaning my hand a lot and creating smaller details. But I've been really enjoying the blocking in stage that I see so many wonderful landscape artists use. So I've been experimenting with this myself in these smaller little studies. And I really love the effect that you get after a very quick, simple block in. And when I'm blocking in, I'm thinking mostly about the darker tones. So I'll try and save my highlight colours for the next layers of pastel. In this first layer, I'm really looking for the places in shadow, getting some of that dark value blocked in. And I'm using always the pastel sticks on their sides to do this. And I'm not being very neat, worrying too much about my outline. I'm really just looking to get an overall colour on the paper. And at this early stage, the important colours to get down are the darker tones. Of course, as I work up through the layers of pastel, I will eventually be adding my brighter colours and highlights towards the end. And at this stage of the painting, I'm never too sure what it's going to turn out like. I'm still deciding on the colours, even though I've laid out some colours in my tray to get me started, colours I think I'll use. But I'm still a little bit unsure in this early stage of a painting. This blocking in method is definitely something I'll have to do quite a lot before I get a real feel for it. So at this stage, I'm looking for the darker undertones that I can lay down, colours that I want to shine through my lighter colours later on. So it seems quite a dark colour to lay down as the first layer of sand that's in sunlight. And then switching to a shadow tone for that foreground area of sand where we dip into the shadow. So in this blocking in stage, I'm really thinking about how the light and shade is affecting the image. Where are those blocks of light and shade? And that's what I'm really trying to block in this first step. So a lot of different purples in this painting. I really love using purples contrasted with lots of greens. That's one of my favourite types of palette to use. And certainly some of these colours do pop up quite regularly in my work. I really love how an artist's choice of colour palette can really identify their work. Quite often when I'm looking at the many beautiful landscape artists there are, I'll know their work instantly just by the colour palette that they use. Of course, your character comes through in your mark making as well, but I think especially so in the colour palette, because quite often you can just glance at a painting and you know who painted it. And I think this is something that just starts to happen over time, because I'm definitely noticing with these smaller landscape studies, I'm accumulating some favourite pastels to pick up in these. So still using the pastels on their sides, trying to make very broad marks at this stage. It's always a struggle for me to not disappear down the rabbit hole of small details. And I find that this blocking in method, where I don't blend anything for the first few minutes and I use the pastel sticks on their sides, I find this part of the process quite liberating. It's a lovely feeling to just block in all of these colours and get the paper covered. And from quite an early stage, I find you can start to get a sense of the whole scene. So the only thing that I don't block in at this stage is the little figure of the dog. I can still faintly see my outline, but I know I'm going to lose bits of that as I start to bring in more pastel pigment around the shape of the dog. But I can still faintly see the line in most places, and I try to get the pastel pigment to come right up to the edge of the dog. I'm already thinking about how the colours in the background just behind the dog might help to contrast and make the bright areas on the dog really pop out from the picture. Now, normally I'm painting pet portraits or animal paintings, wildlife paintings, where you see a lot more of the animal, whether it's a close-up of the face or the full body. Normally they're much bigger than, well, this one's about 1 inch squared for the little dog. And I'm fascinated at the minute working with soft pastel to create these tiny paintings and see how small I can go and still capture some kind of a likeness of the animal. But at this stage I have picked up a little sponge blender. There are many different things that you could use as a blender with soft pastel. You can be quite creative with this. This is one of many little different shaped sponges that I use. And I'm just using the end of it here, softening all the pigment into the paper. Not being too particular about that. It's good fun, this part. I really enjoy smudging and blending and working with the pigment when it's actually on the paper. I really enjoy how with soft pastel you can push the pigment around. You don't always have to apply it exactly how you want it. It's still quite workable and versatile when it's on the paper. And I do a lot of blending and manipulating the pigment when it's on the paper in my more realistic style. So there's a lot more blending in my normal way of working. Whereas with these smaller studies, I really try to limit myself with the blending. There's this main stage of blending that I like to call the big blend. And it's after the block-in stages. And from here on out, I really try to limit the amount of blending that I do and just let the pastel sticks themselves create interesting texture and marks. And although I found that quite difficult to do in the beginning, because I'm in the habit of blending my marks so much in my other style of working, I'm really starting to enjoy that part of the process with these paintings. I love the variety of marks that you can make using the sticks themselves. And you can see that with the pastels I'm using, they're all sorts of different shapes and sizes. They've broken down over time. This one was a full stick at some point. But within my pastel boxes, I've got lots of little shards and pebbles of soft pastel, all of which come in very useful when I'm trying to make a variety of different marks. So after the main bit of blending is done, you can see that I've pretty much covered in the paper quite roughly, apart from the area where the dog is, of course. And as long as I've done that block in where I've made sure that it's the darker tones that I've put there first, then all of my next marks should show up nicely on top of that. And very quickly you can start to create some depth in the painting and in the foliage of the trees. So for the sunlit areas on the path, the sandy path, this next colour that I bring in over the top of that warm red earth really starts to bring the tonal value of these areas up. I'm looking at the tonal value contrast between those sunlit areas on the path and using that to determine how dark I need to go in the shadows and how bright I need the main sunlit sand to be. But it's quite a crisp line between light and shade. And often that is what makes me want to paint a certain scene or any kind of subject matter if the lighting is quite dramatic. And I really love when you get crisp edges between light and shade. So I'm just roughly scumbling that pastel stick over the surface of the paper. And I've switched from using all of the pastels on their sides to using the ends of the pastel more, making smaller marks. Not necessarily detailed marks, but certainly smaller shapes as I come up through the layers. And then with my darkest value, I can also come back in to the shadow part of the trees. Start to hint at some branches in there before I start to add some of the top leaves and foliage. So working dark to light is what I do no matter what style I'm working in, whether it's this slightly more painterly landscape style or my regular, very realistic, detailed style. Dark to light just makes sense to me. And I love how opaque the pastel pigment can be when you're adding those lighter values on the top of the dark ones. So I'm just continuing with my darkest value. I used a little bit of this to block in at the start, and I'm now just adding some extra punch to those darker areas. I want to try and keep my darkest values closer to the foreground of the painting to try and create that sense of depth. But at the same time, I really wanted to inject a lot of vibrant colour into this piece, even in the background. You can see that my photo reference is quite flat in colour. I did add some saturation in editing software before I started to paint. So the photo that you see on screen here is my slightly edited version. But still, I'm not the best of photographers, so I'm really just hoping to capture enough that helps me in the painting process. And then I'm very much using my memory of being there and seeing the intensity of the colours in person, because I can't seem to capture that using the camera. Of course, a very good photographer could, but I'm always just aiming to capture the composition that I want and the basic shapes and colours, but then hoping that I can enhance it later on in the painting stages. And of course, you might have noticed at the beginning that I had to edit my dog Lola slightly to the left. She's so excitable when we're out for a walk. It's actually very difficult to get any good photos of her. I'll be waiting with the camera as she walks ahead of me, and I'm trying to time it so that she just walks out of the shadow and into the sunlight. Now, getting her to pay attention and turn around in that exact moment is very tricky. So I felt like I got quite lucky with this shot, the way the light and shade is, and she's just on the brow of a little hill on the path, which gives us that sense of distance. So it wasn't too bad that all I had to do was move her slightly more into the centre. So there's always a certain amount that you can do with your photo reference. If it's not exactly how you want it, I'm always willing to make edits to the photo reference to help me in the painting process. So using the side of a smaller piece of pastel, again, I can get some interesting marks to start creating the foliage. So I'm not thinking about individual leaves, just trying to create clumps of leaves, leave this whole background area slightly more loose. And I definitely find that using the pastels on their sides really helps me loosen up my marks and not go into minor details. So on this side, a little hint of some of the branches that we can see coming down. And those will disappear into the foliage below. So just looking for any areas here that I need to darken again to create that shadow in underneath the branches. And now with my sky colours, I've got one layer of blues on the sky so far. But now I can really use those blues to shape the outer edge of the tree and to add some all-important sky holes. I've heard them called sky holes by quite a few landscape artists now, and I really like that term because that's exactly what they are. Just adding little peepholes through the trees to the blue sky beyond. And then I'm strengthening up the blue of the sky as well. I wanted to keep the sky pretty plain, just coming down the two blues and creating a nice subtle gradient. And then a very subtle line between the sky and the sea, using the blue-green colour at the bottom. So I'm still using the darker of the two blues. And when I get up around the top edge of the tree, then I will use the lighter blue from the top of the sky. But I really love how adding these little dots of blue can all of a sudden bring some life to a tree. So the lighter of the blues up around the top of the tree. And again, with the pastel on its side, I can strengthen that blue at the top. And I can use the pastel stick on its side just to blend the two blues of the sky together more. So I do the same on the tree over on the left. You can see that I've added some sky holes and shaped the edges a bit more. And then I also use the blue-green from the sea there. And I can use that colour as well a little bit later just to shape the trees that are in the middle of the painting. So adding a bit of warmth through the green foliage now. I try to not just go with all greens when I'm painting foliage. I try to bring in purple tones or red earths. Partly because, of course, there are some of those colours through the tree. If you're thinking about dead leaves, or that's certainly something that you get here. A lot of the green foliage here in the south of Spain has succumbed to the heat, and so rich greens are quite rare down here. Unlike in Ireland, where I'm from, it's literally an emerald country. So it's quite different for me to start painting landscapes more down here. Any landscapes that I've painted, most of them have been Irish, so you're talking 100 greens, really. And down here, so different. You get such a different intensity to the light. And I'm really enjoying changing up my palette for this. And part of that is bringing in more of those brown earths, red earths, and in general using greens that have a bit more yellow content. So in my dark shadow areas of the greens, I'm bringing in some darker blue greens. But in the highlighted areas in the sunlight, it's good to have greens with a bit more yellow, a bit more of that warm earthiness. But of course, wherever you are painting that's local to you, those are things to think about in your own palette. Is it a very lush green place that you live? Or are you more like me in a bit of a desert? And that can really affect your colour choices. And another reason that I've brought some of that warm red earth colour into the green foliage, I'm always trying to create some colour harmony in the painting. And I find that that happens when you can use your entire palette right across the painting. So I always try to not pick up a colour for just one small area on a painting. Of course, it happens sometimes because, for example, here, the colour that I used for the sea, for the ocean, I didn't pick that colour up again for the rest of the painting. But you'll notice that almost all of the other colours get used throughout the entire painting, whether it's on the ground or the dog itself or the foliage. So a lot of those colours reappearing throughout the painting, and I find that that really helps to knit the whole effect together and create nice colour harmony. So I'm just thinking about the areas beyond the dog. You'll see that I try my best not to go into too much detail when I work on the dog. I want the effect to match the rest of the painting. I don't want to go into tiny little details too much. But I also want the dog to look really like she's in the foreground and that all these bushes and trees have some sense of distance behind her. A lot of that will come from the colours that I use behind her to help the edges of the dog sit out nicely. And you will also see a little later on that I do blend some of the area directly behind the dog, the part that I'm working on now, just to soften my marks. So I'm making bigger, broader marks back here, further away into the distance, the less detail I put into my marks, using broader areas of colour instead. So I've zoomed us in a little bit. The dog is so tiny and I want you to see exactly what I'm doing. Now I don't use very much pastel pencil in this painting, just two pencils really, and the first one here is a grey colour, a dark grey. I avoided using any black and I'm really just using the dark grey to help me shape the little dark areas between the legs. And you'll see a bit later that I use that grey pencil to shape her ears and her main features really, which were just too tiny to aim my pastel stick there. But on the whole, I still try to mostly block in the colours using the bigger pastel sticks. And it was my aim to not spend too long on the dog. Again, I didn't want the detail to look really small and controlled on the dog. And I'm really enjoying trying to capture these little studies outside. Without going into too much detail, is it possible to capture a likeness of an animal? That's always my aim when I'm painting pet portraits. And quite often it's the expression in their eyes or some of the details in their main features that might capture their likeness. But in this case, there's so little in view. We certainly can't see much detail in the face. So what becomes more important really is the pose or the stance of the animal. And I think this is true as well if you're painting not just animals but people. If you're painting figures that are further away, you can still often capture someone's likeness just by their pose, the way they stand, the way they hold themselves. And I think it's the same with animals. So the first thing I've done really is to block in some of the shadow colours on the left side of her body. And I'm using a little piece of my brightest value in the palette. And just finding that outer top edge of the dog that's catching the light. I've painted her many times now and I really enjoy how her little bright white coat deals with sunlight. She can look dazzling white when you see her in sunlight. But I always like to try and capture her where you get this top edge that's really going to help her outline stand out. And then you get that sharp contrast on her shadow side. So this is a very small little pebble of pastel, trying to aim it down the backs of 3 of the legs catching the sunlight is not easy, but I can shape that pigment a little with my pastel pencil. So that's really what I'm using the pastel pencil for in this painting, not so much to add pigment to the paper, but to help me shape the pigment a little bit that's already on the paper. So I don't want to leave a very definite outline around the dog. I want the colour of the background to come up and neatly meet the white edge of the dog. But for now, the pencil really helps me to clean up the outline and to find the outline again because my initial sketch did get a little bit buried in the darker pigments. So just trying to bring the legs down and see how the little feet meet the sand. I quite like the idea that some of her toes are buried in the sand. And again, I'm using the grey pencil here just to dot in the placement of her eyes and nose and to outline the ears again. I think when capturing Lola on this scale, as long as I get her little triangular ears and the placement of her eye dots and her nose dot, that does seem to capture her likeness. So you can do a lot with very little. You can create a portrait of someone that's quite recognizable without going into crazy detail. So I'm searching for a little edge on the pastel stick here. This is my darkest value, so I avoided black completely, decided to use this very, very dark purple colour. Dark eggplant or aubergine colour. And I can just about aim some little point of the pastel into the area that I need to. It makes it a little easier if I've outlined it with the pastel pencil. And then I'm bringing that sunlight down the side of the face. So painting on this scale to me is a lot easier when you've got that sharp contrast in light and shade. If the lighting were flat here, I think I would find it really difficult to make the face or the body appear 3D. Because I've got these very definite divides between light and shade, it makes it much easier painting on a small scale like this. The light and shade really helps to describe the 3D form of the dog. And again, I use the pastel pencil, not so much to add more pigment to those areas, just to neaten up the edges of the ears. So we can't see very much shadow coming out to the side of the dog, and that's mostly because I've cut and pasted her in the photo reference into a slightly different area. But she was also just standing in a little dip in the sand, and we couldn't really see much of the shadow, but I decided to add a little hint of shadow just coming out to the left. So if you're adding something like that in, be careful that you add the shadow in the right direction. So we know that the sunlight is coming from the right of the dog, and that would push a little shadow out to the left. So with this purple tone, I can start to find the edge of the dog now using colour rather than line like I was doing with the pastel pencil. So I can bring this purple right down and have it more seamlessly meet the white edge of the dog. And I do the same up around the head of the dog. I can use the background colours now to kind of shape parts of the dog. But really, I don't want to go into too much more detail on the dog. I'm trying to leave the edges of the dog a little bit rougher in places, allow it to take on some of the character of the marks and the rest of the painting. And one thing that can now help the shape of the bottoms of the legs is to bring in the lighter value right across the sunlit sand. And I can use this colour to shape in between the legs. So often it's the colour behind whatever you're painting that can really help you with the edge of the subject. And again, I just take this lighter value now and scumble this across the surface of the paper. I'm allowing little gaps to remain, allowing the first two layers of colour to show through a little bit, hoping to give the sand a little bit of its texture. And I just pick out that little area of sunlit sand in the distance as well. So with my dark grey pencil, I can start to just hint at the mouth area. We've got the shape of the little nose, and then she does have a dark patch just above her lip, and then a little hint at the shape of her mouth coming around the side of the face. I'm careful not to overdo it, because if I think I've caught her likeness at all, then I'm happy to leave it with less detail. And I will come back to her towards the end just for a few final touches. But at this point I decide to leave that area for a while and work on the rest of the painting in the foreground. And I start to add some texture and darker values within this foreground shadow. And then bringing in a much more lively type of blue violet as well within that shadow. So I'm really playing with enhancing the colours that I can see in the photo reference. And now I can start to bring in a little bit more detail in the foreground. Like I said, as I come forward in the composition, my marks get a little bit smaller and more controlled. Still not necessarily looking at individual leaves, but certainly allowing my marks to show a little bit more of the texture of these foreground bushes. Adding in the darker greens first. And then with the strength of these vibrant mid-tone greens, I can add those areas that are being caught by the sunlight. And as long as I've come in with good strong dark base colours, even mid-tones should look really bright and vibrant on top. It was my aim in this painting to not put in too much of the lighter values, to try and leave a lot of the areas of foliage within the mid-tone value range, hoping to increase the overall vibrance of the painting and get closer to capturing the actual colours that I see when I'm there in person than I did in the photo that I took. So just continuing to work from dark to light, coming back in with my darks, adding a little bit more contrast where I need it. And then really mixing those beautiful purple tones in throughout the greenery. So at this stage with the dog, I do feel like I've caught something about her character. And I think a lot of that comes from her pose, her stance. To me, this is her looking back at me, frustrated, saying, please put the camera away and let's go to the beach. And I think I managed to capture a little bit of her impatience in her stance. I'm really enjoying the challenge that presents, where you're trying to pick out the most important bits of information that you want to include in the painting, and being very selective with the details that you do choose to add. So this style of painting is certainly a bit outside of my comfort zones. It's not the way I'm used to thinking about my process. I'm a little bit more unsure when I'm painting these because, unlike with my other more realistic work, I never know how this is going to turn out, and in a way that's quite exciting too. But I know that it's been excellent motivation for me to practice and having this little series to work on. It's very nice to think that I'll build up a little collection of these memories of places that I've enjoyed walking. And unlike my other paintings, this can be done much quicker, so hopefully I can create a little collection of these over time. Whereas I might spend a couple of weeks on one more detailed, larger painting. So I'm using the square edges of this pastel now to create a different type of mark. I'm really enjoying using my pastel sticks to try and create a variety of textures in the painting. And when you're never blending, you really get to see the shape of the marks. That's what I love about many of the wonderful landscape painters who I follow. Many of them are part of this year's Pastel Live. But I really love how in their finished work you can often see the shape of the pastel stick. You can really get a sense of their character with the types of marks that they've made. So just a little bit of blending here in the foreground. I wasn't quite happy with the textures that I was getting on the shadow sand. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I will also do a little bit of blending in the bushes just behind the dog. So if the blending serves a purpose, like I'm trying to create a little bit of distance, then it's good. But other than that, I've been really trying to leave my pastel marks visible. So using the colour from the ocean here, I suppose technically these are sea holes rather than sky holes. But again, just shaping the edges of the foliage there, cleaning up some areas of the sky. So I'm being careful not to go too bright with my brightest values, saving the very brightest one just for Lola's bright sunlit side. And then on the foliage, not going too bright with the colours so that I lose some of those lovely vibrant pigments. But I am bringing in some greens now with a higher yellow content, just dotting a little bit of texture through the main two trees. And I absolutely love the colour that I'm using now. Again, just bringing a bit more yellow into the foliage, giving that slightly drier look that we have down here. And I also really like how this colour contrasts so nicely against all of the purple and blue violet colours. So I decided to bring in another little bit of that in the more distant background. Using a slightly more neutral colour here to hint at the bushes that look very dead to the left of the composition. I didn't want to go into major detail there, and I was just using the stick on its edge, hoping that the little rough marks I created would give that effect. So I'm still learning a lot about how different types of foliage could be captured with less detail. There's a lot of experimenting going on with these. They don't always work out how I want them to. I don't always like them in the end. It's so different to how I normally work. And quite often the process feels difficult at the minute. So more practice for me with these. And I have lots of inspiration around me with these little scenes from my walks. But I was pleased with this one to at least capture the warmth and the feel of the place. I think the colours worked out nicely because it really does remind me of this area on one of our paths. And something that I can never capture in the photos that I take is the sheer intensity of the light down here and just how blue a blue sky can be. So I'm still not quite happy with the foreground shadow sand. I'm just still adding little thin layers of the pastel, letting the other colours shine through. And of course there are some little glints of sunlight coming through whatever tree is casting this shadow, and we get some little stripes of light on the ground. So again, this is the first colour that I put down for the main area of sunlit sand. I'm just dragging that through this shadow area. And the next colour up in tonal value that I used on the sand, also adding a little bit of that. These little specks of sunlight aren't quite as bright as the main area of sunlit sand. And I can just add a little bit of detail here in the foreground. Although we're directly in the foreground of the painting, it's still in dark shadow, so I don't have to go crazy with the detail over to the right, the bottom right. Because we're in shadow here, I can just hint at a little bit of colour in there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I decided to blend a little bit at the bushes that are directly behind the dog, just to soften my marks there a little bit and help the dog to pop out from the background. Of course, your colour choices can be a great help in suggesting depth or distance in a painting, but also the level of softness to your marks or the size of your marks can also give the effect of distance. So just using a little sponge applicator or blender, and I can almost paint with the pigment that's already on the paper at this stage and just soften the overall effect. So I come back to look at the little dog in the middle, and I'm using the brightest value from the sand to shape the bottoms of the legs and the feet. Which is quite a delicate job, but with a little piece of pastel you can usually find an edge for the job that you're doing. And you've seen it pop up a couple of times now. The other pastel pencil that I used was a very light peach colour, which was quite helpful with some of the warm tones in the dog, and especially for shaping the left side of the face. And then finally on the shadow side of the dog, I just want to tone down the colours a little bit, bring in a hint of a slightly more yellow tone, and just help some of those colours mix together a little bit on the body. The final touch for the dark ears, they are catching just a little bit of sunlight as well, even though they are jet black. So I'm adding a little bit of this blue violet colour. And we're pretty much down to the finishing touches now. Adding a little bit of vibrance back in around the edges of my shadows here. I like to do this as sometimes that really makes the divide between light and shade appear as it's glowing. So this was a fun experiment with light and shade. And the final area that I finish off with is just adding a little bit more over the values in the foreground here on the shadow. And that is it pretty much finished.
I hope that you enjoyed my demo and that it might inspire you to have a go at your own tiny dog portrait. And if you'd like to see more of my work, visit me at emmacolbertart.com. I also have lots of videos on my YouTube channel. But thanks very much to Pastel Live for having me, and until next time, happy pasteling.